Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Grogan, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th lecture in our 10-part series, Advancing Health Equity with Medical Humanities. This series was developed in partnership with New York University, the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and the Arnold P. Gold Foundation. Our initiative is part of the Foundation's Gold Human Insights webinar series, and we want to express our deepest gratitude to the Gold Foundation for their support and collaboration on this project. I want to also recognize my partners in the development of this series, Dr. Kim Adams, who is an American Council of Learned Societies Emerging Voices Fellow at Stanford University, where her work focuses on public humanities and medical humanities. And Sharanik Bosu, who's a PhD candidate in English at NYU, where he focuses on economic thought, literary rhetoric, and public humanities. We're absolutely thrilled to have with us tonight Dr. Catherine Belling, Associate Professor of Medical Education at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Belling has worked and published extensively in the fields of medical humanities and bioethics, with scholarship on topics ranging from hypochondria and disease anxiety, to the intersections of medicine with the genres of fiction and horror, to the future of the arts and humanities in medical education. She's served in leadership positions for numerous national organizations, including the Modern Language Association and the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and in editorial board positions for several academic journals, including Literature in Medicine, the Journal of Medical Humanities, and Perspectives in Biology and Medicine. In tonight's lecture, entitled Drowning, Film and the Challenges of Migrant Health Ethics, Dr. Belling will explore how film enables us to think through some of the ethical challenges posed by the healthcare needs of displaced persons, migrants, and refugees. She'll engage questions of trauma, justice, responsibility, and the imagination, and consider how stories of shipwreck, drowning, and survival in film offer powerful metaphors for seeking out livable answers to sometimes impossible questions. A few quick logistical notes. We're just going to ask that folks kindly keep their mics off. Please put your questions into the chat, which we'll be monitoring, and we'll read them aloud during our Q&A portion with Dr. Belling. Finally, we're going to drop a link in the chat with a very brief survey. We'd appreciate if everyone could take a few moments to give us their feedback, and this is a necessary step for anyone who's claiming CME credit tonight.
The best healthcare is compassionate, collaborative, and scientifically excellent. Thank you for being on this mission with us to ensure humanism in healthcare for all. This is a Gold Human Insight webinar produced by the Gold Foundation and its partners.
Hello. I'm Pia Pine-Miller, Senior Director of Strategy and Business Development for the Gold Foundation. The Gold Foundation created the Gold Human Insight webinar series to bring inspirational live and pre-recorded webinars to healthcare professionals and learners. Our 2022 theme is Renewing Our Commitment to Humanism. With the myriad of challenges facing healthcare systems today, including patient disconnection, clinician burnout, and even more challenges highlighted during this time of the syndemic of COVID and social justice issues, the Gold Foundation's vision of a better future remains more urgent than ever. Today's Gold Human Insight webinar is one in a series that is part of a special collaboration with NYU School of Medicine, which is an institution that is a member of the Gold Partners Council, a group of medical schools, hospitals, and healthcare systems that are leaders in humanism in healthcare. Thank you to our presenters and our audience for everything that you do.
Today's lecture is the 5th in a 10-part series on advancing healthcare equity with medical humanities. These slides provide a description of the larger series and accreditation information from the NYU CME office. They are required for attendees seeking CME credit and are available to all who are interested through the Gold Foundation website.
Hello and welcome to this lecture. My name is Catherine Belling and here I am. again. And I teach in the Medical Humanities and Bioethics programs and the Department of Medical Education at Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine. I will not be discussing any biomedical products or devices, and I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. Here's a quick summary of what we'll be talking about, or what I'll be talking about in this class. I'm going to think about how film represents specifically two patient-clinician interactions where the patient is an asylum seeker. And I'll say now that the terminology is tricky. In some cases, such patients can be refugees, in others, migrants in different contexts. The specific case I will be using will be an asylum seeker, but broadly, one of the questions is, how do we define patient populations who come from a background of extreme trauma, from a place that is different from where the physician comes from, which establishes very difficult spaces that need to be covered in order to ensure effective care. So we're going to think a little bit about migrant and refugee experience. And one of the important things is, what else, I'd like to think about it this way, what else will be in the room with the patient and the clinician in interactions like these? And some of the things we can think about are history, trauma, and what I like thinking of as ghosts. What kind of ghosts are present, invisible in this kind of clinical interaction? And then, as you can imagine, when we talk about ghosts, I'm obviously thinking about imaginative stories, fictions, imaginative texts. And what I want to focus on is how film, fiction film in particular, can help to think about these difficult clinical interactions and these larger healthcare problems in ways that might be productive in two ways, both to help the physician do better for the patient, and also, I think importantly, as I put it here, to help clinicians sustain their capacity to continue caring for and caring about patients who in the aggregate are overwhelming. Because what matters often is that you have a one-on-one encounter, but very often for the clinician, that one patient who brings an overwhelming amount of suffering is one of many. And so that there's a tension there in terms of populations with immense needs. And finally, I want to think about how film, and the particular films I'll be looking at, can generate useful metaphorical structures, metaphors that can shift our way of imagining challenges such as these. And particularly, I'll focus on drowning and haunting. So this is my kind of formal beginning. I want to call this talk Drowning, and what that can mean in different contexts. I'm thinking about film and thinking about how we might reimagine the sense of drowning, both for the patient and also for the physician, since I'm assuming that the majority of this audience are physicians and medical trainees. So I wanted to begin by showing a clip from a film. I was unable to do that, so we're going to talk through it. If this were a normal class, what we do here is watch the film clip together and then discuss it with you, telling me what you find in it, what you see, and we would work that way together. Because that's not possible, I'm going to talk us through this film clip and then tell you more about the film in general afterwards. The person you see here is, her name is Bol, and she comes from the South Sudan. She has recently been released from a deportation center in England and has been given the status of an asylum seeker, which means she now has access to government housing and government healthcare. And in this moment that you can see here, she has asked these young men in her housing estate for directions to get to the healthcare clinic. And the response she gets is interesting, but she finds and telling, she is an outsider. But she finds the doctor, and then there's a 2-minute film clip, an encounter between her and this physician, Dr. Hayes, who works for the National Health Service in Britain and clearly works with many, many patients coming from a similar background to hers. And I want us to think about what emerges from this encounter. This is Dr. Hayes, and this is Bol, her patient. Dr. Hayes is young, white, all the things that we think of as privileged, she has status, she has the ability to make decisions about Bowl's health and also about her future within this new context. Bowl has come from South Sudan. She's crossed the entire Sahara with her husband and a group of other migrants. She's crossed the Mediterranean and she's made it across most of Europe to land up in England. She has a long story, which is, I think, part of what is present in this room. The doctor is working very hard to make connections, and she makes a lovely effort. She notices the necklace, the rather childlike beads that are around Bowl's neck, and she says, "I love your necklace." And Bowl replies that the necklace belonged to Nyagak, someone called Nyagak. And the doctor says, "Oh, is that your daughter?" And then tries to connect again. Mine's a real handful. Mother to mother, we're having a friendly conversation. And she goes on, "Have you registered her yet? We should like to take a look at her too." So reaching out to take care of the health of Nyagak. Bowl does not respond. She doesn't answer the question and simply sits quietly while she's being examined by the doctor. Although we can see here in her look, there is both a kind of confusion and also maybe a kind of resistance to the question that's being asked of her. Then the doctor notices these scarification marks on Bowl's side, on her temple. And again, she's seen patients from this area before, so she knows the right reaction. She says, "Those are pretty." She's trying to reach across the kind of cultural difference here and recognize what might be important to this patient, and again, to connect with her. You can also see the kind of almost submissive look on her face. She's trying, she's reaching. And Bowl says that she's had those marks on herself ever since she was little. And then she shows some more cuts, some more scars, and says, "These I gave to myself with a knife." And you can see the doctor's face change. She's concerned now. Is this self-harm? Is this something she needs to be worried about? What does this admission mean? And Bowl then continues with her story. She says she cut herself like that when I found my family butchered. She brings in a piece of her past, which the doctor must digest, respond to, somehow help with. And then as the doctor continues, there's nothing she can quite say at this point. So she continues using her technical competence to continue with the exam. And Bowl continues to explain why she cut herself. She says where she comes from, there are two tribes who are trying to kill each other. And so depending on which tribe you belong to, you mark yourself. And she says that to protect herself, she gave herself the marks of both tribes with her knife so that she wouldn't be recognized as belonging to either. And then her final account of this is to show that she survived by belonging nowhere. And of course, this means not only not belonging to either specific tribe, but also to no longer belonging in the country where she was born, on the continent where she was born. And she now has at last a house which does not belong to her, but in a new place where she presumably is somehow, maybe, safer than she was before. And then at the very end of this very short clinical interaction, she answers the question that is implied but not actually asked by the doctor: who is Nyagak that the necklace belonged to? And she says, "We lost her when we crossed the sea." And so Nyagak is a child who did not make it to England. And in a flashback later on in the film, we see the time when Nyagak drowned in the Mediterranean in the crossing. And that's the only clinical scene in the entire film. I'll tell you a little bit more about the film, but I think what's important is that we're thinking both about the experience of the patient, and in this entire film, Bowl's experience is what matters. This is her story. This is her particular story of her journey, her past, her husband, her marriage, and the house that they move into in England, and how so many ghosts and traumas have followed them there. And what I want us to think about here, and what's maybe more important for you in some ways, is what this means for the doctor, who is a very minor bit character in this film, who appears and disappears, and we see her really trying, and we see her taking on and not knowing how to take on a tremendous burden, the burden which is really the story, the rest of the film for us. And so for the rest of the talk, I want to come back to thinking about what that means for the doctor, and therefore what it means for the doctor's other many patients as well. And it's hard to say that because the doctor is the privileged one, and Boel is the one who has suffered terribly and is the one who we assume is the one who needs the most. I think we can look at both. Anyway, the film is nominally, and well, I guess strictly, a horror film. It's on Netflix. It was produced by Netflix. And if you take away nothing else from this talk, the several films I mention are immensely recommended. I think you will, they all expand on some incredibly important healthcare related questions, even the ones that are not explicitly about healthcare. But His House is about Boel and her husband. You see them here, and their experience in the home they're given in England, and how the house is haunted by the ghosts of what they have brought with them. And I don't think it's too much of a, and this of course includes the ghost of Nyagak, the drowned girl who appears at various points in the film. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to give away that what's really important about the film is that in the end, they learn, the two of them, to accommodate their ghosts, that it's not a film about being destroyed by the ghosts. And at the same time, the geopolitical situation that sets up this film is not just an excuse to create a kind of a scary ghost story, but really a way of thinking about how trauma affects the experience of those who seem, we imagine, to have escaped their trauma, how it comes with them, how it expands out in complex ways, and for this couple, finally, how they learn to live with their ghosts. And I think there's an important piece there in terms of healthcare too, of being able to recognize trauma, recognize ghosts, and cohabit with them rather than feeling the need to destroy them or obliterate them. And I think that is significant for this film and for this talk. I want to suggest a couple of other films that deal with similar issues. This one, Fuokamare, or Fire at Sea, is a documentary which is about the island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean, which is where a great many migrants from North Africa land. And it focuses, it's an extraordinary documentary, just giving a sense of the place, this island, which is sort of on the cusp between Europe and Africa, and what it means when these two different cultures meet each other on this small island. But it includes a quite substantial exploration of a physician who lives on the island, and this is his memoir, and I strongly recommend it too. He works with the refugees who arrive on the island. A lot of his work involves autopsy of people who wash up, who do not survive the crossing. And there's a point, and this is also in the interview that he gives in the film itself, where he says there's no getting used to it. Sometimes I think I cannot hold out any longer. I cannot handle this much suffering, this much pain. And yet he does continue. And one of the questions here is, what is the cost to the physician to be the kind of doctor who feels so constantly that they cannot handle more and yet must? And how we think about that tolerance for suffering, or that ability to continue to work in the face of what seems like endless suffering. And I will say too, in this context, although obviously this talk is specifically about refugees and migrants, I would say there are very clear resonances too with physicians at present and other clinicians who are overwhelmed by COVID, and various other contexts as well, where there are masses of patients and the end seems never to be in sight. But the film I want to focus on most for the rest of this talk is called Stixx. It's a German film by Wolfgang Fischer. It's available on Amazon. And again, this is definitely a positive review, a recommendation. And this film focuses more on the experience of the doctor, and I think forms a lovely kind of pairing with His House. In His House, we follow the story of the patient and how she came to be there with the doctor, and how her life continues as an asylum seeker. This story is very much about a doctor who quite accidentally encounters an asylum seeker. So I'm going to start by just summarizing the story and giving you a sense of what it's about. It's set in Gibraltar, and geography is very important, obviously, for all of these issues, because there's so much about encounters from across great geographical distances. But the film begins in Gibraltar, which is the point at which Spain and North Africa touch. It's really the sort of crossing point of Europe and Africa, and that has great significance. The physician who is at the center of the story, her name is Rika. She's an emergency physician, and she's German but works in Gibraltar. And the beginning of the film, there's a short scene of a car crash, and she actually arrives with the EMTs and stabilizes the patient and goes with him to hospital. But this is a very brief kind of scenario to set up her role, her great competence, her efficiency, her professionalism, and her role, her status as a doctor. But very quickly, we find out that the film is going to be about her taking time off from being a doctor. She sails, and in the film, she sets sail across the Atlantic on her solo, on her sailboat, the Asa Gray. And there's something interesting about the title of the name of her boat, which you can look up, ASA Gray, if you have a chance. He was an important botanist, and it's an important name, but I won't go into that. So she sets off across the Atlantic, leaving Gibraltar and heading south. And there is some extraordinary footage of her, the sense of her no longer being in a city, no longer working as a doctor. She is solitary. She is completely self-sufficient, and away from patients, away from populations, away from demands, and in many ways, I suppose, escaping from what looked like a kind of a burnout situation where she was working very hard as an ER doctor. But then something happens. And first of all, I want us to look at the geography, which, as I said, is important. Her route is going towards Ascension Island, as you can see down in the south of the image. And Ascension Island is important because Charles Darwin attempted to terraform Ascension Island. And I hadn't known much about this, but in the film, she has a book about it, and she very clearly is aiming to go to visit Ascension Island, which is a place that Charles Darwin attempted to set up a synthetic nature, an idealized human developed paradise by completely changing the ecology of the island. And for some reason, this is the place where she has chosen to sail on her own to this kind of, what she thinks of as a kind of paradise. And we have a sense of her route. She sails south, and then one day overnight, there's a terrible storm. And the next morning, looking out of her ship, out of her yacht, she discovers she's no longer alone. There is a boat. It is not moving, just drifting, and it is very crowded with people, and they are waving, and some of them are jumping off. And she recognizes that this is an emergency, of course. And so to go back to the geography, what we deduce has happened, and she gives her coordinates at various points, but she is off the Cape Verde Islands, and there is an active informal migration route from Senegal on the coast of West Africa north, and you see the purple dotted line there, towards the Canary Islands, because the Canary Islands are part of Spain, so that once you land on the Canary Islands, you have made it to Europe. And so it's quite a popular route for migrants and refugees. It's also a dangerous route, as you can imagine, particularly in small, not very seaworthy boats that are often overcrowded. And what we can deduce from the geography of the film is that during the storm, their boat must have been washed, or must have been blown very, very far off course. And they are now drifting near the Cape Verde Islands, which is where she encounters the boat. And the question now is, what will she do? And I've used this film for a course that I taught actually shortly after the pandemic began, when we were in lockdown and the students couldn't come to the clinic. And we very quickly developed some humanities courses that could be taught on Zoom to, so that students were able to continue doing useful coursework without being able to go in and see patients. And I developed a humanities seminar on uncertainty in various contexts. And I used this film for the question of ethical uncertainty, the problem of the moral dilemma when faced with a difficult choice. And for Rika, for the physician here, she has to decide whether to try and help or whether not to, and what the cost is of each of those choices. So first, a little more about the encounter that she has. This comic, and it's worth looking up, I think it's just migratingoutofpoverty.com, was a comic that's used for educational purposes to explain what happens with migrants who make it to Europe from Senegal particularly, and also to give information for potential migrants who are planning to leave Senegal. And you can see from here the route, although going by sea seems incredibly dangerous, that's route number one. If you look at number two, the alternative means crossing the entire Sahara Desert, which obviously takes much longer and is probably even more dangerous. The boat trip from Senegal to Tenerife in the Canary Islands takes about 9 days if you survive. And as the comic goes on to show, those who arrange and take payment for the people who are put on the boats are no longer responsible for them once the boat sets to sea. And the survival of many of the people who do this, who take off on these boats, is not cared for. They take a terrible risk. And so this is what the knowledge we kind of come to as Rika encounters this boat. And I'm going to do a quick detour here for another very earnest film recommendation. And this is Mati Diop's film Atlantique. Mati Diop is a Senegalese filmmaker. And this film tells the story of the people who do not leave, who are left behind. So a group of the young men from this town near Dakar in Senegal leave on a boat. And this tells the story of the young women who are left behind. And as you can see perhaps from the poster, it is both a love story and a ghost story. And it is really extraordinary if you want to pair the two films and think about two sides, and a European and an African perspective on the question of migration. And I think for those of you who may see patients who are coming from different parts of the world, this tells such a different kind of story about the reason people leave and what they leave behind, and how the imagination can think differently about migration. I again recommend it. If this entire lecture turns into a kind of 2 thumbs up film review, I would be quite contented with that. But let's return to Stixx, and obviously the much more serious thing that the doctor Rika encounters when she looks out of her yacht that morning. There's a reason the film is called Stixx. Stixx was the river separating the living from the land of the dead, from the underworld, from Hades. And this Doré image, I think, captures the sense of the danger and the fact that in some ways what Rika encounters is a ship of the dead, a ship of the doomed, of ghosts, even though she can see they are alive. And there are so many of them, and they desperately need her help. What she does is call the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard tell her to stay away. The specific words they use, which are revealing. And I'm sorry, I don't have them here. She's told, do not intervene. So she sends out an SOS, and the cargo ships in the vicinity say, our company has a strict policy. We do not stop or help refugee boats. And the Coast Guard says to her, your presence is provoking additional chaos. To them, you seem to be their lifesaver, but you are not. You can't help them. And they tell her simply to go on with her journey and ignore the people that she can see quite easily are waving to her, shouting, and some of them are now jumping off the boat to try and reach her. And she's being told by all the structures that surround her, you cannot help, you must do nothing. And this is where the kind of appalling moral tension emerges. What does she do? But what happens, the decision is made for her because one young boy, not only jumps off the boat, but makes it quite close to her, and she cannot not throw in a life belt and pull him to safety. And what happens now is she becomes the emergency physician, right? She is extremely competent. She is able to, and he is almost drowned and he's covered with serious burns, but she is able to resuscitate him, restore his body temperature. And the film is very interesting, and it's very quiet. There's very little dialogue, but we see her carry out all the procedures necessary to save his life, the quiet technical medical competence with which she is able to help this patient. And this is a point where we wonder, well, what kind of film is this? Is this going to be, heartwarming rescue film? And we may worry, is this going to be white savior film? Is this the story of her saving this boy and him being grateful and we're meant to feel better? And it is not that kind of film. What happens is, as soon as Kingsley, the boy, is recovered enough, he is outraged because she has only saved him and wants to know how she could possibly not go immediately to the boat and save everyone else. She knows that she doesn't have the resources. She knows that her yacht is far too small to carry more than a very few others. And she keeps calling for help and no help comes. The structures within which she is working now as a doctor cannot help her. She's trapped with the appalling knowledge of the suffering that's going on very close by that she cannot help. And the one patient who is now her single present patient, no matter what she can do to help him, nothing will ever be enough because these other patients, this much larger population, needs her help. Eventually, she does think of something. She is able to send out an SOS, not on behalf of the ship of refugees, but on behalf of her own ship. She sends out an SOS falsely saying that she is sinking, the European woman. And suddenly the rescuers arrive, and what she does is abandon her own yacht and get onto the refugee boat, at which point she finds that most of those aboard have died. She explores the hold of the boat and finds a kind of hell. But because she is now suddenly has presented herself as the one to be rescued, all the structures suddenly fall into place and the rescue begins, which really becomes simply a gathering up of the dead, although Kingsley does survive. So we know that she saved this life, but we also know the extraordinary suffering that she has not been able to help with. And the film ends with her being interrogated, really, because what she's done is illegal. And she looks out of the hold where she is, and what you can see is her yacht, and you can see all the other boats that have suddenly appeared to rescue her, which had not been mobilized to rescue the refugees. But at the same time, we hear, and this is really important, to put her experience and her decision into context as these procedures are followed. We hear the incoming radio calls saying things like vessels in distress, 500 passengers, and coordinates are given, 350 people on board, vessel in distress, help is immediately requested. There are sharks, 160 people. I repeat, vessel in distress, assist if possible. There is an overwhelming chorus of calls for help, the sense of an infinite need for assistance, which puts into context the one life she has saved, and also the sense that no matter what she could possibly do, the need is utterly overwhelming. And that's the end of the film, which may, and this is not to tell you shouldn't see it. There is a lot more in it than what I've told you about, but it seems like a terribly depressing film. I know that the students at the end were like, well, thanks, that was sad. But I think what it does too is allow us to think about what it means to be faced with an overwhelming need, and coming from a place where you can't quite reach across the gulf of need, the kind of hauntedness. And we saw that with the doctor trying to reach Bull as she talked about her family being butchered. And we see it here where Rika tries to reach Kingsley, and he's not grateful and he doesn't connect back with her. He is querulous and demands to know why she can't do more. And in that context, we can imagine giving up. And I think what both of these films do in surprising ways, despite the sadness of both their stories, is to suggest that there is another way of thinking about this. And I want to turn to a colleague of mine, Lisa Diedrich, who works in the health humanities. Her book, Treatments, captures something which I think is very useful. She talks about an ethics of failure. And I think it's something that perhaps medicine can reach for more. As physicians, you are trained about the ethics of success, of course, and about striving for success, and about the need to succeed and to be heroic and to rescue and to be kind and to be compassionate and empathic and all the things that, of course, are ideals, and which can sometimes be possible with one patient in the one-on-one situation. But so often you are reminded that even if you save, and I use that term advisedly, one patient, there are always others. And in this kind of context, as in the context of COVID, perhaps, there are always more, and you will not always succeed. And Lisa has this quotation at the end of her book about what she calls an ethics of failure. And she says, doctors and patients who are brought together by illness have to risk failure. And what's important is that risking failure, I realize my image is in front of my text. In risking failure, they also risk relation. You risk connecting, because the risk of connecting is often the risk of failing to connect. But nevertheless, the risk must be taken. And she says, by taking such risks, we open up the possibility of new routes in and between art, medicine, philosophy, and politics. And she points out that those are all necessary for crossing that kind of gulf between patients and physicians, that medicine must also constitute art and philosophy and politics. And she says there are no shortcuts. It's not enough simply to survive. Telling this new tale requires work, the work of mourning, the work of politics, the work of language, the work of love. And then says an ethics of failure takes failure not as an ending, but as a beginning. And I think it's a valuable rethinking of what it means to acknowledge that success is probably not possible, but that within recognizing that you can never do enough, there may be a place where an opening can emerge for doing much more than might have seemed possible, and also for surviving that process without being overwhelmed, without drowning. Recently, a slightly different take on the same question I noticed an article about it in the Atlantic, and then went back to Viktor Frankl, the philosopher and psychologist and Holocaust survivor, who wrote in Man's Search for Meaning about what he calls tragic optimism. And the recent Atlantic article, in the context of COVID, was talking about the danger of what we've come to call toxic positivity, the idea that if I'm just good enough, I'll be able to succeed, we'll survive this, we'll take care of ourselves, we'll be optimistic and grateful and so on. And he shifts the idea to the idea of recognizing that our context is tragic. And this film, more than just about any other, in some ways, I think ends with that note of tragedy, of absolutely overwhelming potential for failure, for a sad ending. And yet there's this strange counterintuitive idea that within that recognition can lie a form of optimism, if it means doing the best one can within that context and being able to recognize that that is the best, if it's the best one can do. And I want to end with another film clip that I think makes this very clear. We have these two encounters between doctors and patients. The one where the doctor is clearly doing her best, but cannot break through to the patient whose experience is so incredibly different from hers, especially when we imagine that she has another patient waiting in the waiting room with a different, similarly traumatic story, and then another and another. And then we have the other doctor, Rika, who's trying not even to be a doctor, right out in the middle of the sea all on her own. She still gets to have to make these medical decisions, these ethical decisions, and faced with this patient who she has saved, but what she does is clearly not enough. He doesn't accept that it's enough. And by the end of the film, we realize that it must be enough for her, but it can never be enough for the world. And so at the center of the film, I want to look at one other piece. Kingsley turns to her, and I think you can see off in the distance, the boat is there. They're drifting away from it. She has saved him. She's been told by the Coast Guard to move away because she's making things worse because people are jumping into the sea to get to her, drowning. And Kingsley doesn't understand. He cannot accept that she won't go back and save his sister. So he says to her, "My sister is there. Why won't you go back for her?" And she says nothing. We've seen her struggling below decks, trying to get hold of the Coast Guard, and she has kind of given up at this point. She feels there's nothing more she can do, but she also can't explain it to him. So she says nothing, and it frustrates him terribly. He says, "Talk to me, please." He begs her to help. And as she tries to move about the boat, he grabs her leg and holds onto her. She's the only hope that he has to save his sister and to make sense of what's happened to him. And she tries to help, but she can't say anything. She remains silent, and she pulls away. And as she pulls away, he gives her a push, and he pushes her overboard. So now she is the one in the water. She's the one potentially drowning. And there's this incredible moment where he sits in the boat, and you realize that he is lost without her. She is drowning. And there's an extraordinary sense there of the question of who needs whom and to what extent, when we're in a situation where things are this potentially hopeless, and where as a film viewer you wonder where the hope can be found in this. But he does turn things around, reenact what she did for him, throw the rope overboard and allow her to climb back on board her yacht, the Asa Gray. And there's a brief scene once she gets back on board the boat where she now can speak. And she says, she now answers his question, "Why won't you talk to me?" And she says, "I don't know what to do." It's a quite simple answer. She simply says, "I do not know. Help? I can't." And then the camera moves and they look at each other directly. And we see both of them. I wish I could show you the scene itself. They look at each other, and there is an encounter here, which I think, I would argue, goes beyond the sad ending of the film. There is an encounter here that is direct, where each needs the other. And the doctor is no longer being heroic. She is no longer being a savior of any kind. They're two people within an intolerable context who recognize the capacity of humans to see each other and to do the best they can in that context. And I think what matters in this scene is that within the film itself, within the scene itself, everything is hopeless. At the end of the film, things are depressing. No one else can be saved. And all you hear are these thousands of voices of the drowning, and who will be the ghosts, who will haunt everybody in the film. But as the viewer of the film, we get to see something which perhaps the characters might not recognize until years later, if ever, that there is something else at work, a different dynamic that involves communication, involves effort, and recognizing that complete success is an impossible thing to hope for, and that an ethics of failure, of recognizing, as she does, first of all, I don't know, I can't help, and then to look the patient, the other, in the eye and move on from there to do as best as one can is an extraordinary lesson, I think, and one that I think would be valuable in healthcare, where you're so often led to think that what you need to be is heroic, to be a savior. And that's where I'll end. And I'm grateful for your attention. These are sort of takeaways: the importance of film, the importance of imaginative literature for rethinking what may seem impossible, for thinking about sort of outside of the standard frameworks for what counts as failure, what counts as success, what counts as horror even, or ghosts. And to think about how that kind of imaginative openness can be helpful, both, of course, to patients who are drowning, but perhaps also to help clinicians who are often drowning in a sea of need and challenges, and might help sustain. And here's my contact information, and I look forward to having a chance to discuss this with you more at some point when the group actually convenes. And these are the last of the slides. Many thanks.
Thank you all, and thank you, Catherine, for such a great lecture. Now we turn to the Q&A portion of our session. And so I'll ask you to type your questions into the chat, and I'll turn it over to Shranik, who will take it from here.
Yeah, we'll probably need some time for people to type. That's the case.
I can say two things in the meantime while people are typing. One is just that was so weird because that was winter and December, and there's this sort of very strange sense of watching oneself do something long ago. One thing that I only realized after I did this talk for the first time was the connection between drowning and being overwhelmed. The words always help us. That I only realized later that the etymology of overwhelm comes from the Old English word quelm, which means to drown. So they are very directly etymologically connected. So yeah, there is an almost literal connection there between drowning and being overwhelmed, which is satisfying.
All right, we have a question from Woods. I agree that the value of sustaining one's capacity for suffering is important, but when we focus on individual caregivers in that way, do we risk failing to consider how to increase our system's capacities for suffering?
Hi, Woods. I saw your note earlier. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important point, and I mean, one of the things that the film does, I think, is although it's very hard to tell. I mean, one of the things about narratives, right, is they circle on it, or they center on an end value of one. It's very hard to tell a story about the structures without focusing on an individual or a small group to become the center of the story, the characters of the story. And I think one of the things that this film, that Stixx does especially well, is to create the very clear sense that what she, not even in the role of a doctor strictly, right, is dealing with is this massive structural failure that is leading, I mean, and the film doesn't, it puts all those pieces there and doesn't make any effort to answer those questions, but says, here are the questions, here are the problems. And hopefully, take this as the starting point. This story cannot provide a happy ending, a solution for this doctor or for these people or for this boat, and so on, or for any of the, but it makes absolutely clear, you can't finish watching it without saying, why are the structures like that? Why did these people have to be out here in this boat? There's a wonderful poem about, I could look it up in a moment, that I also sometimes use in relation to this. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. I'm sure some of you have encountered it, but thinking about the structures that lead people to be, that, who have to leave home. Why do people have to leave home? And why do they need to become so vulnerable? What are the structures that produce that? And then why is there not a just structure that then enables them to leave home and without taking the kind of risks that these people take? And in some ways, why is it that one doctor should be suddenly at the sharp point of these massive structures of injustice all around her? And I think the film does a really good job of making that a story by sort of focusing on the sharp point rather than giving us statistics about injustice, which are overwhelming in a different kind of way and can very easily lead one to simply say, well, it's too much. Where do you start? How do you solve that? And so I think that's part of what this does, is that it's the film doesn't say, here's a solution for this doctor at all. It doesn't help. It doesn't say we're going to make her feel better or we're going to make you feel better. It says this is the point at which you can look at the things that need to be changed. And it's a kind of starting point. And certainly for students, it worked that way. It sort of led to them, well, okay, so, now we've got to change the world because we can't fix this little problem over here. Yeah.
It sounds like Coast Guard is some of systems restraints, indifference, etc., leaving individual caregivers vulnerable to onslaught.
Exactly. And you can think of various analogies, right, in all sorts of ways, where very often the physician is left as the one who's vulnerable because I'm sure all of you are immediately thinking of all kinds of analogies where the social unjust social structures leave the physician to be the one who is confronted with the effects of that injustice, with those unjust structures, with the damage to health that is done by structures which are outside the individual's physician's power, and yet leave you the one, having to figure out what can be done in a situation that is inherently tragic. And I think the idea of tragedy is actually quite useful there, sort of as a literary idea too. Yeah. Mm.
I guess, well, the next question is being typed. I had just one thought, which was, I'm not a physician, but as a person who does literary studies, it's really hard to tell stories about systems,
Yes.
Because it's difficult for the reader to connect. And I was thinking about like examples. And the one example that came to my mind of this, fiction that talks about massive social injustices is Charles Dickens' novels.
Yes.
And, his technique has always been to kind of scope out and then scope in. You scope out and talk about vast landscapes of inequity, and then you scope in and talk about one little boy's misfortune.
Right.
So, that kind of works.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And obviously when you have, you could do the very long version of this film, you could certainly go into, which is why in some ways, like looking at Atlantic, the film set in Dakar, which goes in a whole lot of interesting ways into the reasons that these people would have been on this boat in the first place. And, not that it's this, they're made by different people, but the kind of the structures that lead to leaving and what it means for the people who are left behind and what alternatives they might, and the sort of economic pressures on, so that I think you can, which is sort of what Dickens does, right, is gather a collection of different stories that give you different facets on that same point. Yeah. It's a nice connection. Whereas this Stixx is like the kind of the sort of chamber version of this, where you're completely isolated and you have this single interaction, but everything else is there and you can't escape it, you can't avoid it. Yeah.
Joanne, thank you so much for that poem. Is by Warsaw.
Oh yes, that's it. Thank you. Yeah, I have it. I gave this talk again for a different thing for our students and added the poem to the slides and realized that it wasn't here. But yeah, it's an amazing.
And then Toshi has a question for you. How do your med students react to these films?
Hi Toshi. The students I found I've taught it twice, and both times I think they found it obviously depressing. It was like, oh, that's a sad story. But I think in both cases, very thought-provoking. Certainly with the fourth year students in the uncertainty class, thinking about this situation in relation to questions about moral distress and things that they were familiar with by that time, having been through their third year through the clerkships, and sort of talking about instances where they had encountered, a patient that they felt things needed to be done for, but who couldn't because of they couldn't do what they needed because of insurance, or because they couldn't, they were fine and they wanted to send them home, but they didn't have a home to be sent to, or, it sort of led them out to think about other situations where they feel that they are working as an ethical physician within an unethical structure, and how to manage that. So I think the film you sort of almost a kind of allegory of a lot of seemingly sort of smaller experiences, but that have produce that same sense of, and of feeling at some level guilty that they can't do more, and having to think through what it means to be able to work within the structures and know at what point, you say this is the limit of what a doctor is for in this situation, and then I'm always like, well, you guys, you're the next generation, you're going to fix all these things, right? But yeah, I think it's sort of setting up that context, and then also recognizing how important it is not to be so overwhelmed that you drown yourself, because then you won't be able to help the next person. And so I think there is a sense of that too. And even that is framed in the way that she, at the beginning of the film, she gets on her yacht and she's going to go to this incredible island that she's dreamed of going to. And obviously there's something very cruel about the fact that, all the structures are set up that she'll never get to go to Darwin's imaginary perfect island that he manipulated the climate of. And if you do a bit of research, you then find out that it was a disaster. All the native vegetation was destroyed, and the island it's now used mostly for practice for going to the moon or going to Mars, or it's become this. It's well worth looking up. It's become this sort of strange desert jungle place that he tried to manipulate. And so there's something there in the film too, that she's trying to get away from her work and sets off on her own to this place which isn't the paradise that she thinks it's going to be, and instead encounters the real world, even more real than it was where she was just working as a ER physician in Gibraltar. So we kind of talk through all those pieces. Yeah.
And then speaking of taking care of doctors, Kim's question, I wonder, thinking about Gabriel Winnen's recent book, it's called The Next Shift,
Yes.
about the economics of healthcare, American healthcare, how doctors came to function as a form of social safety net in these contexts.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, I'm not sure how much I can add. I mean, it seems like, yeah, that's another sort of clear analogy in some ways. And yeah, I mean, again, sort of keeps coming back to the question of what is a doctor? What is a doctor for? And what are we training our physicians for? And what structures make their work more difficult? Or how do we expand the idea of what the profession does? And then how do we support our graduates to be members of a profession that has a different kind of responsibility to simply treating illness or diagnosing disease, or however you want to narrow that down. So I think that has important implications, and more now, more the last couple of years than ever. Perhaps it's become more obvious, I would say.
I think we have time for one more question. We're already on time, but if someone has one more question that they want to ask. Oh, we do have a question. Okay, Sebastian asks, you showed those two intense examples of one-on-one communication where it felt like an enormous chasm between the doctor and the patient. Did you notice any themes or techniques among all these films on how to jump across it? We try ourselves and to teach our students to build rapport. Are there times when it is just impossible?
I guess it depends what you mean by rapport. I mean, I think one of the moving things about this scene in his house is how that doctor is working really hard, and I think in many ways, she does all the right things. She does connect. It's just that she, well, I don't know. Maybe they're not the right things. I mean, within the scene, we are very much on the side of the patient, I think, but at the same time, at this point, it's very early in the film. We don't know yet. I mean, when the patient says, "I saw my family butchered," that's the first time we know that too. And yet we see the physician doing, I think, all she can to connect, to ask a very sympathetic question about the evidence of a child's necklace without realizing that the child is dead, and that's why the mom is wearing the child's necklace. So there's an effort to build rapport, but I think there's also the sense that, ideally she would then spend a lot more time with this patient and unpack her sort of obdurate silence, the questions that she doesn't answer, and where that is coming from and what that means. And we would hope that there are structures within the NHS where this woman would get, the kind of counseling, the kind of support that she would need. It seems unlikely within the context of this film. And again, that's one of the problems, is the resource intensive requirements of people who have had to leave home and are not at home and are usually there in large numbers with immense needs. And rapport is difficult because it can also be an easy way, I think, to produce a kind of superficial niceness, which maybe encourages the patient to be, yes, thank you. This is all fine. I'm fine. I don't want to bother you. You've been very nice to me. Goodbye. And the trouble leaves with them, and the ghosts in the room haven't been addressed. I think that's also part of that. So rapport is a difficult thing. What it means to really cross a gulf that is, far too big to cross simply by having a nice conversation is one of the big challenges that I think that both of these films don't refuse to paper over. They both say this is a bigger question than simply having the patient feel grateful. There's something more difficult, more challenging going on.
Thanks, everyone. I know we're just over time, so I want to bring us to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellings, for such a fantastic lecture and a great discussion. It was lovely to have you, and really appreciate your time. As I mentioned at the top of this event, this was the 5th in a 10-part series, so I just want to quickly mention our next lecture is coming up on September 15th with Vignesh Sridharan. The title is Edinburgh, Boston, and Women in the Medical Schools of the 19th Century. So I hope that folks will join us for that. I know there was a question about this being recorded. Kim mentioned in the chat, but just in case anyone didn't see, the session was recorded and will be posted if anyone would like to disseminate it afterwards. Thank you so much. And again, just that reminder for folks claiming CME to please do the survey. That we'd of course love feedback from everyone. Thanks again, folks, and have a wonderful evening.